Hello, DevCon, and thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you today. It's an absolute pleasure. My name is Ben Greenbank. I've been to DevCon twice as an attendee, and this is my first time speaking here. Before we begin, here's a brief introduction to my background. I'm a software engineer here at Algolia, and I'm part of the personalization team, which is in our AI search organization. Now, my team recently launched our AI personalization product into public beta. So, of course, if you would like to know more about that, please check out the announcement on our website. I joined in August 2022, and I recently celebrated my second anniversary here at Algolia. I was originally a front end engineer, but a year and a half ago, I transitioned into a full stack role, focusing mainly on the APIs that enable our personalization product. I'm from the UK, in case you couldn't tell, and the reason I include that is because it's apparently not obvious to everyone. I was recently very surprised to hear someone say I sounded like I was from Australia. And finally, I'm a self proclaimed perfectionist. If you don't know what that means, it's like being in a never ending sprint race with just yourself and somehow always finishing in second place. Now, as you may have seen already, today I'd like to talk to you about a lesser discussed topic, which is how you can amplify your impact without writing a single line of code. And if that title is a little too cryptic for you, I'll give you a clue that this is a presentation covering topics such as communication and developer culture. So let's get started. I'd like to take you back to just after I joined Algolia and talk about some of the challenges that I was facing. Now, even though I've been working remotely for the past 2 years, I still found async work difficult. Firstly, I felt quite isolated. For some people, that's a blessing, and for others, it's a curse. For me, it's both. I get to do what I want right after work, but I also don't get that authentic connection with people that's only really possible in person. Next, communication over Slack is just not the same as in person communication. And to be honest, it never will be. I found it much harder to ask for help since I couldn't lean over to the person next to me. And going from a company of only 30 to being introduced to around 800 people on an all hands call, I was pretty overwhelmed with finding out who to ask. I remember on one of my first days, I was trying to figure out my way around the dashboard code base, and I was being really hard on myself for not already knowing how the whole thing worked. And finally, good feedback on Slack didn't quite land as well as in person. I'm not sure why, but perhaps it's because there wasn't any positive body language to back it up. So, those are some of the problems I faced with remote work. And I'm sure your next question will be, Ben, what was your solution? And I'm more than happy to reveal my secrets. Ah, yes, that's right. So, I didn't quite have a solution yet. With everybody talking about the new normal, I figured that I would just have to carry on as I was and put up with it. But of course, it doesn't have to be this way. And it turns out that the internet didn't have all the information that I needed. Now, remote work is certainly not the same thing as independent work. It took me a while to realize this, but once I knew that the culture here at Algolia is built around helping others and being curious about problems, it became much easier for me to work remotely. And I don't feel the same fear that I used to. As the Harvard Business Review put it, with a shift towards remote work now leaving many of us isolated from our colleagues, the challenges of asking for help have only intensified. To me, this highlights the unique challenges that remote workers face, which we didn't see so much as even 5 years ago. And I see this continuing to be a challenge for years to come. So, what have I concluded? Well, don't take it personally. Async communication is hard, and you should give yourself credit for being able to work remotely. Slack messages can mean different things to different people, and even Zoom isn't the same. Now, I've spent a lot of time wondering whether a smiley face is authentic or sarcastic, and in answer to that, it's almost always authentic. So be sure to ask how other people do async. Some won't do work without a ticket, and others are more flexible and prefer Slack huddles. So get to know how your team works. If your request for help is clear and concise, then you're already halfway there. So don't be shy. I remember so many times where I was worrying about how best to ask for help, when in fact, all I needed to do was ask. It didn't need to be perfect. And finally, get to know your teammates in person where financially and logistically possible. My team recently had an offsite in Paris, the first where we were all together as a team, and it proved that the occasional in person collaboration really does add the icing on the cake. But that's not all. No, it's not that easy. And here are some more challenges that I've faced. Now, first, and perhaps most common when it comes to starting as a new company, I was scared of breaking things. It helped that the product I was working on was in pilot, but I still had the fear of being the one to blame when things went wrong in the dashboard, for example. Next, I felt like I wasn't quite as good as our other engineers, both in my team and beyond. Now, our team is unique in that we're quite senior heavy. All but two of us are at senior level or above, and when you've just joined, it can be hard to see beyond those job titles. And finally, these factors contributed to a general feeling of insecurity in my role. This was my first software company, and I felt like I had to prove my worth to earn my place. So, what was my thought process at the time? Well, it was pretty harsh. I felt like I needed to fix these problems or else. So, by now, many of you will have identified what was going on here. And indeed, I was suffering from a case of imposter syndrome. Now, if you'd met me at the time, I doubt you would have got this impression, but deep down, I had the persistent inability to believe that my success was deserved or had been legitimately achieved as a result of my skills or efforts. This definition is a pretty accurate representation of what I was experiencing. As I said previously, I was negatively comparing myself to other engineers, and I was insecure with what I'd already achieved. So, for the second time today, I hear you ask me, well, Ben, what was your solution? It seemed pretty simple. Work harder, right? I wanted to earn my place, and the easiest conclusion to make was that I had to work harder. So, that's what I did. I started lots of side projects. Now, I'd prefer if you didn't ask how many I finished, but if you'd still like a clue, then it's a multiple of zero. I started completing leak codes in my spare time because, well, that's what all the other engineers at the big tech companies do, right? And I subscribed to endless YouTube tutorials so I could top up my knowledge. But it didn't quite hit the spot. I found myself facing the same challenges as before. I was still scared of breaking things. I still didn't feel like I was as good as other engineers. And I still had that feeling of insecurity. And after spending quite a lot of time thinking about the imposter syndrome dynamic, I've come to the following conclusions. As a headline, I now truly believe that engineering isn't everything. Now, believe me when I say that I'm well aware of the irony of saying something like this at a developer conference. However, if you stay with me, I'll show you why I believe this is so important. So I say this not just as a way to forget about those problems we've talked about, but rather because that's what I've seen demonstrated both here at Algolia and beyond. There are countless great engineers here, and each one demonstrates excellence in areas beyond engineering. Being technically proficient is just one tool in their chest. And therefore, relentlessly pursuing technical knowledge, as I demonstrated earlier, might be wasting your time and your energy. Instead, I've tried to amplify my impact in other ways, such as cross functional collaboration by being an enabler for other teams. I think of myself as an engineer who has a deep understanding in one technical area, our APIs, and a shallower understanding of other important topics. And I strive to have an impact in a broad range of areas. And lastly, remember why you are hired by your company. You have nothing to prove. And that leads me into the final set of challenges that I was experiencing. First, I'd only ever worked at companies in the UK before. So, in terms of the ways I receive feedback, my experiences were quite limited. Now, if you're from the UK, and perhaps even if you're not, you'll know that British people have a funny way of telling you what they mean by not actually saying the words. We're the masters of sarcasm, and so much of our communication culture is about body language and implied meaning. So it's safe to say that I had a bit of a culture shock when I experienced the more direct feedback style of my teammates from Romania. So I know my presentation has been pretty light on code so far. So to demonstrate what I'm talking about, let's import a translation function from an external package. Next, we'll invoke that function to translate the feedback I would normally expect to get when something isn't great into the feedback style of my Romanian colleagues. Ah, yes, it's bad. But now I think about it, perhaps I needed to hear that. Now, all humor aside, given my lack of experience in different feedback styles, it was hard for me to not take that personally. But to be honest, there's not actually much to fix here. Nobody's crazy, and everybody's doing things the way they know how. Now that I'm over the initial culture shock I mentioned, I'm much more comfortable with experiencing things in this way. That's not to say that it didn't take a while to figure this out, though. First, let's recognize that different cultures are, well, different. It might sound obvious, but in my experience, it's not obvious to everybody. And leading on from that, let's learn to embrace those differences. In my opinion, it's much more fulfilling to have different experiences than to have the same one over and over. So, be your authentic self and don't change that for anyone. And finally, if you're lucky enough to be able to travel internationally, and last year that was only around 1 in 10 people, then make the most of it and learn about other cultures. So let's recap what we've talked about today. First, we talked about the challenges of remote work. We recognize that it's difficult and that we shouldn't be afraid of asking for help. We also talked about the positive experiences of in person meetups where possible. Then, we talked about imposter syndrome and how the relentless pursuit of technical knowledge won't solve everything. And we were reminded that we were hired for a reason. And finally, we talked about the different cultures here at Algolia and how I've learned to embrace them. So, thank you so much for listening to my talk today. I really hope that you found it interesting. And if you do have any questions, please follow up with me on the social handles on the screen. Thank you.